Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Tangent TV. My name is Joseph Lanzalata, and I am here today with the amazing David Gluckman. Welcome, David. So, just to give you a brief introduction that I'm sure will not do you justice, but I know you're going to tell us more about as you go. David is the creator of Bailey's Irish Cream and and many other famous drinks brands that you all may know and love. He also is the writer of the book That Ship Will Never Sell. That is the only time I'm going to get away with saying that on Tangent TV, but today it's okay. So all the links to everything David are down in the description of the video. But for today, David has a talk to give to us to round out our storytelling series. David's talk is going to be about David is going to be telling us about inside the box thinking, and that is going to round out our storytelling series. So without further ado, I want to go ahead and welcome David Gluckman. David, you can take it away whenever you're ready.
Thank you very much. Very nice to be back talking to people in Trinity. I've been in the ideas business for about 50 years, some would say too long. And I suppose I've found a lot of evidence of jargon and hype in the field. People talk about thinking outside the box and breaking paradigms and that kind of thing. And I think in all the years that I've been doing this, I found the whole process to be very much simpler than perhaps people might give the impression. I'll give you an example. I used to play for a pub cricket team. I played for them for 30 years. And every so often I'd develop a new drink and bring it along and show it to the other guys and get them to try it. And I remember this particular drink, it's called St. Ledger, and it's a mixture of white wine, orange juice, and sparkling water. It was developed on the hypothesis that a lot of people didn't like beer, but they liked a long drink that wasn't too strong in alcohol. And I showed it to some of the guys, and one of the people turned to me and said, "Did you get paid for this?" And I said, "Yeah, why?" He said, "Well, it's so obvious. Anybody could have thought of it." And he was absolutely right. I think anybody could have thought of it. But to me, I think the essence of good ideas is that they are simple. They're predictable. They don't require a huge intellectual leap in order to understand them. And I think St. Ledger, I think the first alco-pop in Europe was an example of this. And it led me to look at a quote from a pair of academics. I don't often agree with academics, but I think if I had a headstone, I might put something like this on it, because that summed up exactly what my cricketing partner had to say about that St. Ledger drink. Okay, well, a bit of background. I was born in South Africa. I was raised and educated there. And when I left university, I wasn't really clear what I was going to do. And then my dad had a book which was lying around called Madison Avenue, USA. And it was the story of advertising in America in the 1950s. And I read it and I thought, this sounds like a really interesting career to look at. I had no idea what I was going to do with my life. So I read the book, I went out and had some interviews and managed to land a job in an advertising agency. I think I made a mistake though. I wanted to be like Don Draper. I wanted to be a creative genius, writing all these wonderful advertising campaigns. But because I'd been to university, they turned me into Pete Campbell, a sort of rather boring interface between clients and the creative people. So I tried to sell ads rather than write them. I came to England in 1961, continued to do exactly what I was doing there, worked in an advertising agency right up to 69. And there were a couple of influences on my career, I suppose. I worked on Procter & Gamble, and I worked on a brand called Mr. Clean, which was a liquid household cleaner. It was quite revolutionary in 1962. But one of the things about working on Procter & Gamble and Mr. Clean was, I think it kept me honest for my entire career. It told me that no matter how romantic and sexy the job that I would be doing might be, I was basically in the business of selling soap. So that was, I think, the first influence, and it was an influence I kept for the rest of my career. I always felt that I should find a reason for people to buy my product. The other influence was our agency was involved in the development of the Kerrygold brand. It transformed Irish butter from a commodity with no identity into a brand which commanded a premium price. And there I worked with a famous and very charismatic man called Tony O'Reilly, who was, I think he was 28 when he ran the Irish Dairy Board. He was a famous rugby player and went on to become one of the most famous businessmen in Ireland. And I think he taught me something also. He said the suggestion was that there was more to creating brands than simply creating profitable entities for people. Kerrygold was a kind of national cause, and the success of Kerrygold, of which I was a very small part, I might add, had quite a lot to do with the Irish economy and the boosting of the Irish economy. So I took those two influences with me throughout my career, and certainly the Irish part of it was going to be quite important. But in 1969, I was about 30, and I decided that I couldn't go on being a middleman. So I went to my boss and I said, why don't we set up a department in the agency to help companies to develop new products? How much about that did I know? Precisely nothing. But I read a lot and went on a few courses, managed to get a trip to New York. And I was very lucky right at the beginning of my career to meet a man who worked for a drinks company. And that drinks company stayed with me as a client from 1969 to 2005. It was called IDV when I first encountered it. That's International Distillers and Vintners. It was a global company, but not massive. It was big enough. In 1997, it merged with Guinness UDV, Guinness UD to form Guinness UDV. And then later in 1997, it became Diageo, which is the largest drinks company on the planet. Well, anyway, in 1973, my partner and I persuaded IDV to give us their business. And we set up on our own in Greek Street in Soho. And about a week into our business, a brief came in. The background was that the Irish government was trying to encourage people to export, and they were giving a very strong financial incentive to brands that were developed for export. This was very encouraging and exciting. And then a brief appeared. Now, briefs these days are incredibly formal. In those days, it was what the brief came in what we called the Wexford Whisper. Someone in Ireland said to someone in England, who said to someone else in England, who said to me, we need a new Irish alcoholic drink to export. That was it, nothing else. Very simple. There were no constraints, no parameters, no suggestions that we use this or use that, or we look at this market or that market. That was it. That was as far as it went. And it was pretty challenging. And I can remember being in the office on a Monday morning, cold May Monday morning, and saying to my partner, what are we going to do about this Irish brief? And we chatted a bit, and I said, is there anything in my experience of Kerrygold that we might bring to bear on this? And he said, languidly, what happens if we mix Irish butter, Irish cream, and Irish whiskey? Now, he was a conceptualizer. I was an action man. So I said, well, there's only one way to find out. Let's go down and get some stuff and see what we can do. Went down to the local supermarket, bought some Jameson Irish whiskey. I think we bought a quarter bottle because we just started in business. Then bought some cream, went back to the office, mixed the two together, and it tasted utterly ghastly. I was a bit disappointed because I thought it might have been an interesting idea, but I said, okay, let's go back to the supermarket and ferret around and see what we could find. And we came across this on one of the shelves, Cadbury's drinking chocolate. So took it back up to the office, mixed it to an awful concoction, added a bit of sugar, tasted it. This was all very hit and miss. And we ended up with this. And that became the product. I was pretty excited by it. Put it into a screw top bottle, hopped into a cab, went over to see my client. He tasted it, said, "Hey, this is great. Why don't we do it?" So we were off and we were running. And we tried something. I mean, we had no technical vision as to whether this could be made or not. It was just an idea. But we figured there were people smarter than us who could perhaps bring it to life. Next thing we had to do was find a brand for it. And the brand came from a very unexpected source. We were moving office in Soho from Dean Street to Greek Street and went along to visit our new premises. And if you look at the top left-hand part of the picture, there are 3 windows backed by white brick. And below it, there's the name of a restaurant, which was of no fixed ethnicity, called Bailey's Bistro. And I remembered one of the things that Tony O'Reilly said to me back in the day when we were working with him. He said, you know, if you ever use an Irish family name for a brand, never use one like mine, O'Reilly's. I said, why not? He said, because they sound whimsical. Those were his words. And so I said, okay, that's interesting. And Bailey's just seemed the perfect name for what we were trying to do. So I called up my client and said, why don't we call it Bailey's? And he got very excited by it. The next thing we did was to produce a package, and that was the very first pack that ever appeared for Bailey's Irish Cream. I think that was the US pack. And you'll notice that on it, we had the term Irish Cream Chocolate Liqueur. That's what we recommended to the company. And when we eventually presented it, chocolate disappeared. Anyway, what happened next was we spent about 6 months trying to get the product right. We then printed some labels and put them on bottles, filled them with our brown stuff, and took it to Dublin. Prior to that, we did a couple of focus groups. They were pretty new then, just to find out what people thought of it. And the response was pretty negative. Men said it was a girl's drink and they'd never been seen in a pub or in public drinking it. Women said it reminded them of kaolin and morphine, which is a diarrhea remedy popular in the 1970s. So with this information in our hands, we went to Dublin to present the idea. And much to our delight, the company really were very excited by it. They took off the name chocolate from the package, which I think in a way is quite significant with ideas, because the most important person in the development of an idea is not the person who has it, it's the person who buys it. And when they took chocolate off the label and changed the vision, they began to own this product. And I think from about sometime in November 1974, which is 46 years ago, my ownership and connection with Bailey's has gone. Hundreds of other people have affected its change. And what happened with Bailey's? Well, that's my favorite pack, I think. Last year, it sold 7.1 million cases, which is about 85 million bottles. It turned over $1.7 billion, and it's part of a category which is worth about double that, $3.5 billion. And when I think back, it was 45 minutes in Soho in 1974, created all that. It's a pretty amazing feeling. And now on to something. I love that quote by Tom Freston, who founded MTV. It's an incredibly simple definition of innovation. And basically what we did was we put together that and created Bailey's. And I think to me, that is inside the box thinking. It's thinking based on what you know and what you remember and what you can see. it didn't require any sort of magical talent to produce. Bit of luck, perhaps, and quite a lot of cheek, but apart from that. Now, a different theme that I want to talk about, and that's how do you compete with mega brands? There are very big brands out there, and if you want to compete with them, I think you should aim for the ankles, not for the heart. For the heart, people sometimes make big mistakes like that, and I'll give you an example. Virgin in the 1980s, I think 1970s, from the time it was developed, was the brand everybody loved. It was hugely confident. It was entrepreneurial and everything else. And Richard Branson and his Virgin brand ventured into 3 categories during the 1980s. First, they took on Coke head on with Virgin Cola. And they had a product that they claimed was preferred by Coke drinkers when they were compared blind. The next thing he did was he had to go at vodka, and he produced Virgin Vodka. I was engaged, excuse me, it's an old cough, by the way. I was engaged with Virgin Lager, where Mr. Branson wanted to get up close and personal against Budweiser. And what happened to all 3 of these? They failed. And the reason they failed was because they were offering exactly the same product. I remember when I met Branson for the one and only time, I said, if you want to compete in the beer market, I think you should offer people something different rather than something exactly the same. Because no matter how strong your brand is, these brands have been around for a lot longer. So Virgin Cola died, Virgin Vodka died, and Virgin Beer never got off the ground, which from my point of view was a very good thing. I'll give you an example of how. I think if I was competing with Coke, I would produce something like sour cola. That would be rejected by 95% of the people who love Coca-Cola. But of the 5% that remained, that would be a huge potential market. I think you have to be different when you're competing with brands as big as that. And I'll give you an example of this. We were given a task to come up with something to beat Red Bull. And Red Bull offers energy. It reaches parts that other people don't reach. It's the all-over energy drink. It gives you wings. Now, the only way to compete with that, in my view, was to compete with part of it. So my suggestion was that we should develop a product that gives you mental energy. Forget about physical energy. And I came up with that, which is one of my favorite brands that never even got onto the drawing board, but I absolutely loved it. It was called IQ. It was nootropic, and we called it the Think Drink. And if there's anyone out there who are entrepreneurs and you want to steal the idea, please do. I wish you would, because I loved that idea. I'd really wanted it to happen. Okay, on to something different again. Back into the 70s in the UK and the wine business. In 1972, a heavy drinker of wine, and markets divide between heavy, light, and medium drinkers. And heavy drinkers usually account for 20% of people, but they account for 80% of total consumption. But a heavy drinker in 1972 drank 2 bottles of wine a month. Imagine that, 2 bottles of wine a month. I've had 2 bottles of wine at a lunch not so long ago. So it's extraordinary to think that this was the extent to which wine had penetrated the UK market. And if you think of what people were confronted with in those days, there were shelves with a sea of unfamiliar French names that people couldn't pronounce, labels that people couldn't understand. Nobody had any idea. Wine was something that induced diffidence, shyness, fear, you know what. I just said that I found that the other day, and I thought, gosh, I would have real difficulty pronouncing that, so I won't do it now. But imagine having to go into a place in 1972 when your French was a bit iffy, and asking people for that be incredibly difficult. But there were brands, there were wines out there at the time that were making headway. There was Blue Nun, and to an English consumer, Blue Nun was very easy. Easy word, easy to recognize. The package looked different. It wasn't just a plain white label with foreign lettering on it. And Blue Nun made a lot of headway. But I think a lot of people regarded wine as being, real wine was red, not white. And we had a brief from the CEO of the company to develop a French red wine brand, because however well Germany was doing in other countries, in those days, France dominated the wine market in the UK. So Blue Nun was an incredibly useful lesson to us and provided the template for the brand we eventually produced. We discovered that the company, and this again is looking into the box, the company had bought a French winery called Piat in a few years earlier. And Piat it had two benefits. One, its name was 4 letters. So it's a lot easier to remember than several of the other things we saw previously. And secondly, it had a very distinctive shape. So that person who bought a bottle at the beginning of the month and then went out and bought a second bottle at the end of the month would have no difficulty, A, remembering the name, and B, remembering what the bottle looked like. But Piat itself, if you look at the label, wasn't special enough. It just looked like another French wine. So we had to make Piat special. How do we do that? Well, curiously, we found the solution in the cigarette market with a brand called Benson & Hedges. Benson & Hedges is really interesting because people would smoke ordinary cheap cigarettes during the week, but on the weekend when they were showing off and when they wanted to impress their friends, they would pull out a packet of Benson & Hedges. And there was something about it. It looked classy, it looked smart, it looked expensive, which it was. And so we took the idea of Benson & Hedges, applied it to Piat, and turned up with the Piat d'Or. So now we had a brand. We had something that people would be able to remember. We had something that people would be able to recognize on the shelf. And these were very important elements. And again, common sense, inside the box thinking, no magic formula here at all. The last thing we had to do then was how do you go back to French winemakers and tell them what kind of wine you wanted them to make? Well, I went back to my Blue Nun kit. I bought some Blue Nun, poured it into a glass. I then went to a supermarket and bought some red food coloring. This food coloring has no taste, but has the effect of transforming the appearance of something. So we had Blue Nun on the left, and we had our new wine on the right. And what we did then was we took it to a French winemaker and said, can you produce us a French red wine that has this kind of character and this kind of taste? They looked at us as if we were mad and said sacre bleu and whatever else French winemakers say. But they made a wine. They found a way of adding grape must, which is sweetened grape juice, to produce a product. So Piat d'Or became the real hero of the wine market in the UK. It's the biggest selling wine in the UK by the early 1980s. Sadly, it seems to have disappeared, but that's outside my knowledge. Now, one of the points I made earlier, I think, is that no matter how smart you think you are when you come up with a great idea, the real heroes of ideas are the people who buy them, not the creators. They're people who work in companies, who stick their reputations on the line to buy an idea. And I'm going to give you a great example of somebody I worked with who bought an idea very quickly. Bewley's is a famous cafe in Dublin. It's a sort of must-visit place for most people who go to the city. And Bewley's in 1984, 10 years after Bailey's, decided they were going to launch a coffee cream liqueur. The Baileys people were up in arms about this and summoned me and a couple of other people to Dublin for an emergency meeting. We had it at a hotel next to the airport. On the way into the meeting, I stopped in the bar to buy a box of matches and noticed they were pouring a pint of Guinness. And it just looked gorgeous. I couldn't help stopping and watching the whole process. Started out like a giant Baileys, and then it divided into these lovely black and white miracle, which looked almost good enough to eat. Anyway, that planted a seed in my head, and I went to the meeting. We got to the meeting at the hotel, and rather cheekily, I said to the client, "Would you mind if I order a pint of Guinness?" I think by then Bailey's had become quite a professional organization, and I think he was a bit up in arms about this. But he finally agreed. And when the Guinness appeared, before the briefing started, I held it up and said, "How would you like a coffee cream liqueur where you drank the coffee, pointing to the black part, through the cream, pointing to the white part?" And he said, "Tell me more. How would you do it?" And then I remembered something else, which is going back to the 1950s, I suppose. My father had in his cabinet a bottle that looked something like this. It was two bottles joined together. One part had one liqueur and one part had the other. But I was now improvising. So I said, well, imagine a bottle where 3/4 is the black stuff and 1/4 is the white stuff. And the black stuff has a great big hole at the top. So when it pours into a glass, it cascades out. The white stuff has a much smaller hole, so it trickles and settles on top of the liquid. And that was the end point of what we suggested. It was a brand called Sheridan's. And I must say, the whole process took about 5 minutes. And the guy bought the idea on the spot, which I found absolutely amazing. And one of the things that struck me about Sheridan's was that last year it did 305,000 cases. It turned over $98 million. And yet I don't think anyone's ever heard of it or seen it. I don't think there are going to be anybody in this meeting who will have tried it. I'd be very surprised. But over the years, it's produced about $1.5 billion in income and sold something like 90 million bottles, I think. But the whole procedure here took about 5 minutes, and I think is an incredible tribute to the person who bought the idea. I'm nearly finished. If you're in the business of looking for ideas, sometimes when everything else fails, try the New York Times bestseller list. We did this back in 1990, and we found a book which is called Managing Your Mind and Mood Through Food. We were doing a food project. And what we did was we developed a range of food products which helped your performance. If you were out giving a presentation, you would eat protein. If you were needed to concentrate over a period, then you would have complex carbohydrate. And it was called that. And I think it's always, if you're looking for something that's going to be big in 5 to 10 years' time, then go to places like this where bestsellers appear, because they are read, these books are read by opinion leaders, and they lead to, excuse me, the innovations of the future. My last story really is that the world is changing. The coronavirus is changing it, but there are other moves afoot which are changing our approach to everything. And I think if I was starting my career in brand development now, I would say to people, look, it's no longer just about profit. We have to look after the community. We have to look after our countries. We have to look after the planet. These are very real issues that are occurring. I'll give you a very quick story. I shared a platform in Athens last year with a young man who represented a company in Holland. And the story goes like this, and it goes back to 2002, I think. A Dutch journalist was doing an examination into practices in places like Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire when it came to cocoa plantations. And one of the things he discovered was that an awful lot of the work on cocoa plantations was done by kidnapped slave child labor. And he said this is wrong. So he went out and bought bars of chocolate from all the major companies, called the police in Holland and said, I want to report a case of child abuse. They said, who is the abuser? And he said, I am. Anyway, the case was heard in the Dutch court, but was thrown out because Cote d'Ivoire is outside their jurisdiction. But as a result of this, the journalist and a few of his friends produced the world's first slave-free chocolate brand. It's called Tony's Chocolonely. And I'm happy to say, apart from being a brilliant chocolate, it's the #1 selling chocolate brand in Holland, which just shows that the Dutch population is almost double the price of Cadbury's Dairy Milk, for example. But the Dutch population are prepared to put their money where their beliefs are and to support something that's genuinely trying to save the world. So that's my story. I'll just leave you with a few key points. The head of the table. There was once somebody told me a story of a tycoon who was sitting in a meeting of about 12 people, and somebody deferentially turned to him and said, "Excuse me, CJ, would you like to sit at the head of the table?" And he said, "Where I sit is the head of the table." This is a good point, I suppose. But I think the point I'm making here is that the best work we ever did was when it was commissioned by top people within companies, people like O'Reilly, people like Sir Anthony Tennant, who was the head of IDV, who asked for Piat, people like the Irish who asked for Bailey's. I don't think ideas start in the middle of organization. They start at the top of an organization. I think that's very important. I think the next point is the power of one idea. I think if you're in the business of producing ideas, you should look to produce a single idea. I got to a stage working with my drinks client where if I came up with more than one idea, they said, you don't have any. And I think with Bailey's, there was no plan B. And after Bailey's, I always operated on the principle of no plan B. I came up with the best idea I could possibly have. I've talked enough about inside the box thinking. I think it's a question of just looking in front of you rather than trying to con people into believing in some kind of magic. The USP, again, you know, in my job, you're selling something. You're trying to persuade people to buy it, and the unique selling proposition is still so important. The primacy of the product. I don't think I've ever produced a product or ever been associated with the development of a product that I wasn't totally proud of. And I think it's very important not to think that packaging will give you the answer or some sexy advertising campaign. At the end of it all, your product has to be the real hero. Bailey's was a very good product, as was Piat. The data bank, get back in. I think companies spend huge amounts of money on research and then they do it and they put it away and they forget it. I spent most of my life digging in research files, and they provided the basis for most of the ideas I had. Two minds, one thought. Again, ideas don't work in committees. They don't work in large groups. Committees turn turn horses into camels. I think the best progress of ideas anywhere is between two people who both have the same thoughts and both have the same vision. I think we should also put consumers into perspective. I think there's far too much trust put into consumer research. I read somewhere the other day that 85% of all new ideas fail. And most of those ideas are, in fact, put into market research and assessment by consumers. So if they're wrong 85% of the time, it's a pretty ordinary craft. So you have to be wary of it. Don't spend as much money on it as one is inclined to do. I made the point about the buyer king. Finding people who are good at buying ideas is just as important as finding people who are good at having them. And I think, as I've said with Tony's and other things, brands now have more than a profit mission. They have a social mission. So I'll leave you with another quote, which I think makes my point about artificial intelligence, about thinking inside the box. AI is the classic example of thinking inside the box because it can only deal with the information that's available. And I think that, I hope that makes my point. One more thing to say, if anybody's interested, all these stories and many, many more are available in my book, which you can get through my website or through Amazon. I'd prefer it if you got it on my website. But thank you all very much indeed for listening.
That's amazing. Well, thank you so much, David, for taking the time to come and share these stories with our audience. There's been a lot of people actively in the chat asking some questions. So if it's okay with you, I might read them off to you, if that's okay.
Yeah, do I change anything now? Do I say stop share or something?
Yeah, if you want to stop sharing and then we could just both be up on the screen, that'd be great. Well, I find the first question here. Perfect. Awesome. So now we have ourselves. So I was just going to ask the first one. I think you kind of may have already answered this, but I just wanted to share it anyway. Are there any products you left on the shelf or didn't take to market that you wished you had launched? And then also, did you develop anything that flopped at the time but would have flown in a different era?
The answer to both was yes. That IQ product that I showed, I absolutely loved. The food product never happened. IQ didn't even get onto the drawing board. I developed a product called distilled Guinness. It transformed Guinness into a distilled spirit. That didn't happen. There were loads of ideas that didn't happen, but you don't win them all. And there was a failure. There were failures too, sure. Piat doesn't exist any longer, so that could be construed a failure. St. Ledger was a brand I loved, but that doesn't exist either. So there were failures too, but a few successes.
I guess there's always going to be the ups and downs, but that's the journey, right?
It is, well, once you develop the idea, somebody else has to run with it. So there's
Absolutely.
not much you can do.
Amazing. So there's somebody here who says they've read your book. There are a few people who said they've read your book before, but they want to know what's coming next from David. So what's next for you?
Well, in fact, I've almost finished a second book, which takes a backward look at some of the brands that I've developed. I mean, if you think about it, it's 46 years since I had anything to do with Bailey's. So it's kind of nice to look back at it and say, well, would I have done things any differently? And I would have done. So I've looked at 8 brands that I've developed, plus one that I developed a margarine brand that never happened, but I thought it made for an interesting story. So that book is, I hope to have it out in June, because it's going to be an e-book this time as opposed to the heavy
paperback you carry around. Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, we'll have to chat to you at that point and see what's going on. I think there's at least one or two more. I'm just gonna run through. There's, what was it? We'll go down. There are a few people who've said they've read your book. There's somebody here from Miami Beach. Very welcome. Any drinks brands in the current market that have impressed you, or any upcoming brands, and why did they impress you?
Well, I think the market has become incredibly dynamic. I think the gin market frightens me because it makes me feel quite happy that I'm not in the business of developing new gins, because there are so many of them that it's almost mind-boggling. These hard seltzers seem to be very successful at the moment. There are lots of things. I'm still keeping my hand in and doing some development with people, but I don't want to talk about it.
It's still a Black Ops secret project. We'll wait to hear from you about it.
Absolutely.
Interesting. Well, yeah, no, it's interesting you say about the hard seltzer market, because I know when we had spoken about that before, you had shared that it's almost a resurgence. It's not necessarily something new. That category has existed, but it's something that's now coming back into the fold. Right?
Well, that's quite interesting because, I mean, first there was, I think the first brand of this kind was called California Cooler, that happened in about the late 70s in California. And then we did St. Ledger. And then there was a plethora of brands, including things like Bacardi Breezes, which all happened. And then there was an Australian drink called Two Dogs that arrived. It was a lemon flavored RTD or Alcopop. And that gave the market another kickstart, which culminated in the development of Smirnoff Ice, which was hugely successful. And then it went quiet again. And now it started again, but in the guise of hard seltzer. So it's a pretty dynamic market out there.
It is pretty interesting, and we'll have to wait to see what comes next. We're looking forward to see what comes next from you. I think that's kind of the end of the questions, so we might just wrap it there. But I just want to say thank you so much for coming on, David. To anybody who's watching this, you can see all of the links to David things in the description of this video down below. And yeah, once again, thanks so much for coming on, David, and sharing your amazing stories with us. This rounds out our storytelling series. So thanks again.
Thank you very much indeed, Joe. It's always been a pleasure.
Amazing. We'll wrap it here.
Okay, take care. Bye now.